My name is Siobhan O'Mahony and I'm a volunteer on the Women's News subgroup of the LGBT Heritage NI project. Along with my co-volunteers Elspeth, Nadine and Amy, I want to share with you and recognise the power and legacy that is Women's News. So Women's News was a voluntary feminist collective publication from 1984 to 2010 based in Belfast. There were many women involved in the collective over the years, and I want to name some of them here to recognise and record their achievement. The founding members were Margaret Ward, Maggie Feely, Mary Ellen Knox, Christine Hammond, Christina Loughran and Margaret McCullough. From 1986 to 87 onwards, the mantle was taken up by Maureen Mulholland, Catherine Couvert, Suze Tweedy, Fran Devenny and Sheila Page, among others far too numerous to mention. It was produced from Maggie Feely's house until it moved to an office in Donegal Street in 1988. In late 2001, the publication relocated to Royal Avenue. It cost 15 pence per issue and circulation was 300 to 500 readers. This was seen as significant at the time in terms of impact and networking. Mulholland and Devenny later went on to set up Maeve Publications and were responsible for publishing the lesbian cartoon book Sappho Woman and the Greater Belfast Dykes, along with Unmanageable Revolutionaries, a collection of feminist essays. Catherine Couvert stayed on until 1999, and so for 13 years she was a driving force of the magazine. She has described a myriad of skills learned during her lengthy tenure at Women's News, including writing, editing, design, fundraising, admin, illustration and finance. She drew up the business plan in 1996 for the EU funding application, which later helped to finance Women's News until it ceased production in 2010. In their very first issue, Women's News published their Womanifesto. This was in March 1984. It reads, "We decided to launch a paper for women to publicise events, to provide a space for views and opinions, and to allow groups to let other women know what's happening. A forum for communication, and we hoped that from that, a strong movement of women would be created." You could see from the Womanifesto that there was a desire to give women a voice against a backdrop where their views on issues that affected them were not represented. According to Maggie Feely, the collective were very much interested in lifestyle politics. Women's News had an ideological background, with most of the founders being heavily involved in a variety of campaigns, including reproductive rights and issues around women in prison. The collective was diverse, including lesbians, heterosexual women, mothers and non-childbearing women. They felt strongly that Women's News should be representative of all issues affecting women at the time, not just any single issue. Although they held a variety of different views, everyone was passionate about supporting women and rallying against patriarchal domination. One of the main purposes of the collective was to create a space for women wherein they could find out what was happening, how to get involved with social justice campaigns. So you could say that Women's News was a catalyst in mobilising women to action. The first public meeting on abortion held in Rosebery Street in Belfast in 1984 was covered by Women's News, and this type of change-making social justice meeting would never have been acknowledged or represented by the mainstream press at the time. One of the biggest objectives of Women's News was to facilitate a joining of women together, providing a platform for them to find like-minded women. The contact section started small and then grew over time to fill the whole of the back page with events and resources for women from all walks of life. This networking rapidly extended from north to south and further afield. In 2003, a linked edition was produced in conjunction with Link, the Cork-based lesbian and bisexual women's organisation. Women's News included many arts and cultural musings also. Ruth McCarthy, who is now the artistic director of Outburst Queer Arts Festival, contributed to the magazine from around 1990 for a few years. She wrote opinionated and entertaining music reviews, which were often accompanied by her own distinctive fanzine-style cartoons. In these examples from 1992, her cartoons are having a not-so-gentle dig at the patriarchal or heteronormative expectation of polite and demure lady-strumming balladeering versus unapologetically brash clit rock. Ruth has spoken about the refreshing creative freedom allowed by women's news. The juxtaposition of reviewing riot girl bands like Babes in Toyland and Bikini Kill, alongside some of the more traditional lesbian favourites coming out of the Olivia and Lady Slipper record labels, is pretty unique. Finally, I want to just talk about a comparison of the front and back covers from between 1989 and 2010. So earlier issues created by the volunteers of the collective using whatever resources they could obtain. Typesetting and layout skills were learned on the job with rulers and scalpels. There was no such luxury as staples. This cover features a really powerful illustration by the renowned artist Louise Walsh, who was a member of the collective in the late 80s also. The difference between these earlier editions and the later glossy magazine produced after the 1996 EU funding was granted is very noticeable, though one might argue that the fanzine charm was lost in later years. Content-wise, there's also a clear distinction as the local activism angle seems to dissipate and is replaced by a more global feminist viewpoint. Entire issues were dedicated to topics including education, housing and finance in later years. We can also compare the back covers from 1989 and 2010. You can see here the back pages of earlier issues carried the personal contact connection that I mentioned earlier, dating ads, details of local women's groups, and social events north and south. In later years, this community networking focus shifted and we see glossy and presumably paid for adverts appearing in the back pages. Countrywide helplines and resources for the likes of Women's Aid and Lesbian Line were also featured in the back pages, and these remained constant throughout the years. So in conclusion, aside from the social and community-led goals suggested by the Womanifesto in their very first issue, it's very clear that women's news was also a political force in terms of women's rights. Maggie Feely has said it was important for women to feel empowered through their concerns being given attention. For many women who felt they didn't fit neatly into any particular category, and to quote Catherine Couvert, there was a place for you in women's news.
Hi, I'm Elspeth Vischer, and welcome to the second part of our presentation on women's news. I'm going to be taking you through the grassroots LGBT organisations involved with women's news, with a particular focus on the 1990s time period. So who was involved? As you can see from these logos, I'll be taking a look at Lesbian Line Belfast, as well as Queerspace, and another faction known as Lot Belfast, or Lesbians Organising Together. They later changed their name in the mid-1990s to LOLA, Lesbians Organising, Lesbian Activism. So firstly, going through Lesbian Line. It had existed since 1974 as part of Cara Friend, and then Lesbian Line became distinct in 1989 in Northern Ireland. Lesbian Line aimed to provide frontline services for lesbian and bisexual work from a group of volunteers in the forms of a helpline, befriending and information services, mental health and support counselling, advocacy and social support, as well as training and promotion for equality and human rights. Despite winning a prestigious award from Cooperation North for their work in 1990 in both Belfast and Cork, there was still a lot of prejudice faced from Lesbian Line. They were invited to a public ceremony and press dinner with other winners until plans changed, as I quote from this article in an April-May edition of Women's News from 1990. Cooperation North decided to change the arrangements. Instead of the award ceremony in the Arts Gallery with full press and media coverage, there was to be a private award lunch at the Saints and Scholars pub at 1:45 on the 8th of Feb, to which the press were not invited. Belfast Lesbian Line felt that the last-minute change in the presentation arrangements and the decision not to invite the press was an attempt to avoid adverse publicity. It is particularly galling that an organisation which claims support among grassroots alternative groups can make choices which silence women's experiences. So this goes to show Even with the accolades, it was clear that there was hypocrisy within organisations and homophobic action at this time. So cross-border organising. There's numerous examples of grassroots organisations based in Belfast organising with those down south for both activist and social endeavours. Inspired by Dublin Lot, or lesbians organising together, this article from February-March 1995 in Women's News details plans for a Belfast equivalent of Lot to be set up to deal with the specific fuzzy information surrounding lesbians in Northern Ireland and their legal rights. Came in the wake of the passing of a bill in England to set the age of consent for gay men to 18. The fact there was no clear legal framework whatsoever for many issues involving lesbians was deemed unacceptable in this article. So, on the changing of the name of Lot, despite lots of cross-border organising, it's evident from this humorous article in an April-May 1995 issue of Women's News that the Belfast Lot group wanted to make themselves distinct from their Dublin sisters by changing their name to Lola. As Catherine Couver writes in this short piece, what does Lola do? Well, we organise amazingly beautiful, though not always amazingly well-attended events. We plan for bigger representation of lesbians in lesbian and gay pride. We collect information on lesbian parenting, lesbian rights, services sympathetic to lesbians. 3 lesbians in 1 sentence. Not bad. I'm practicing for visibility, actually. And this showcases, alongside the fact of the dykish events detailed in the right-hand column of this article, the kind of tongue-in-cheek and DIY aesthetic that Women's News had at this time in the 1990s. So another vital peace process era grassroots incentive that's written about across numerous issues of Women's News was that of Queerspace. Formed in the late 1990s, when queer was becoming a more commonly used, reclaimed term by young LGBT people. It's clear that the ethos behind Queerspace was to provide a safe and relaxed environment for LGBT people to come and spend time in. It was a vital asset to many, as detailed in this interview with Catherine Couver in 1998 in this issue of Women's News. And as the description from this article states, Queerspace is a plush hangout featuring couches and coffee, books and magazines, live music, readings, and whatever else you plan. It's a space maintained by and for the community, our community. This project is grassroots funded. So the importance of being grassroots was integral to both Queerspace and Lesbian Line. As you can see from this quote, Queerspace aimed to serve the community and be funded by generous donations of patrons to replace whatever they could, whether that was with a cash donation or some more coffee. Lesbian Line likewise was about working with the local community to befriend and provide a vital support system for those coming out in an often unhospitable environment, and it was self-sufficient and ran by volunteers, as we heard. As Catherine Couver stated of working as part of the team at Women's News at this time in the 1990s, it was all very on a shoestring, but despite limited means, this gave us the freedom to publish what we wanted, how we wanted. I think this is clear from the work done to showcase and make lesbians more visible in the 1990s from working with these grassroots groups, such as Lesbian Line and Queerspace. Thank you for your time.
My name is Nadine Gilmore. I'm a PhD student at Queen's University, and I'd like to talk about another important theme that's discussed in Women's News, queering the family. Traditionally, the family and queer identity have been understood to be fundamentally at odds with one another. In the past, queerness and familial ties have been understood as 2 mutually exclusive entities. Catherine Conrad, in her research on nationalism and sexuality, discusses the perceived threat to the family posed by homosexuality. Homosexuality, she says, does not fit neatly within the discourse of bourgeois nationalism, since it threatens the reproduction of the heterosexual family cell that serves as the foundation of the nation state. However, following the gay liberation movement of the 1970s, society's ideas about lesbianism and the family began to change. Gay liberation encouraged all lesbians and gay men to embrace their sexuality and to participate in a sexual revolution by coming out. This mass coming out often included those who had borne children in the context of heterosexual relationships. The gay liberation movement brought the queer parent out of the shadows and into the media spotlight, where queer custody of children and reproductive rights became a highly controversial topic. By 1976, it was reported that no lesbians in Britain had won custody of their child, and by 1978, British tabloids were raising concerns about lesbian access to artificial insemination. One London doctor, popular amongst lesbian patients, was dubbed Dr. Strangelove. Gay and women's rights movements of the late 20th century brought new possibilities for lesbian and gay parenthood and raised fundamental questions about traditional conceptualizations of the family. This is evident in women's news, which demonstrates a queering of the family firstly through discussions on lesbian motherhood. The feminist magazine, The Reproductive Rights of Women, matters relating to maternity pay and equality in the workplace, as well as articles detailing solutions to the problems experienced by single mothers, were a staple in the publication. An examination of women's news demonstrates that by the 1990s, lesbian and bisexual women were no longer seeing their sexuality as incompatible with motherhood. Women's news allowed women the opportunity to read about the experiences of other lesbian mothers. One 1998 article included an interview with a lesbian mother, Rita, and her daughter, Katie. The article stated, lesbians have started to consider motherhood as a choice in their lives. We talk openly about getting pregnant, becoming a mother, wanting to raise children, often what seemed to be impossible 5 years ago when lesbian motherhood wasn't an issue much talked about, and most lesbian mothers lived in a semi-closet. The article went on to detail how coming out had been an important time in Rita's life, and the concerns that she had about custody issues, family support, and what her sexuality would mean for her daughter Katie. In spite of these concerns, Rita advocated for the positives of lesbian motherhood. The wide variety of feminist opinion on the idea of motherhood more generally was included in the magazine. A November 1992 issue of Women's News included an article about lesbian separatism, which was critical of the institution of motherhood and stated that we separate ourselves from male domination, from activities that are destructive to ourselves and each other. Male serving behaviours and addictions, parasitism, the birthing and/or caretaking of males, and the generally unquestioned institution of motherhood. The magazine also pointed to instances of heteronormativity within the wider feminist movement in Northern Ireland. We can see in this cartoon, taken from a strip entitled My Best Friend, I Don't Mind You Being a Lesbian But. The image shows a lesbian woman caring for her child, while her friend insinuates that only ordinary women, not lesbians, have the responsibility of looking after children. Secondly, Women's News provides insight into a queering of the family through articles relating both to queer children and the children of queer parents. In addition to advocating for children's rights, particularly in relation to being free from worries of domestic violence, Women's News also raised awareness about services which would benefit queer children. The magazine featured advertisements for Parents Line, which provided the parents of queer children with advice about their child's coming out. Women's News interviewed Emma Walton, the woman who founded Parents Line, about the organisation's work. Walton, whose daughter had come out as a lesbian, discussed the importance of accepting a child's sexual orientation. She said, "You'll find this with your gay children. They need you and your support far more than your straight children, because other people are quick enough to turn your back on them." In spite of the fact that Parents Line was intended to assist heterosexual parents in accepting their child's homosexuality, the line was also contacted by numerous young people who sought acceptance from a parental figure, even if it was not their own. In Women's News's interview with Walton, she discussed the positive impact that the line had had on young gay men and women. By including the advertisement about the service, Women's News played an important role in consciousness raising with regards to the welfare of LGBT children and adolescents. Additional concern for lesbian and gay youths can be seen in an article about the practice of outing, which was popular in the 1990s. Women's News advocated for the need for young lesbians and gay men to have positive role models in which to look up to. A magazine columnist suggested that young homosexuals, like young heterosexuals, need role models to cope with their identities. New life, new love. To cope, they need to dream of some idol, someone they admire to cling to and help them through their hard times, their adolescent crisis. There's been much progress made in terms of the acceptability and even the possibility of queer families. As of 2012, same-sex couples in Northern Ireland have been able to adopt a child. Fostering is also possible for single lesbians and gay men or by same-sex couples. However, there still exist many barriers for the acceptance and possibility of queer families. Same-sex couples often face barriers in accessing fertility services through the National Health Service, for instance. However, there are now also a number of support groups for queer families and their children, such as those offered by organisations like Here and I.
So in the final part of this presentation, I am going to discuss the role of women's news in the establishment of the first Belfast Pride Parade, which took place in 1931. First, I am going to provide some contextual information in the run-up to Pride and detail some instances of discrimination that women's news faced in the early 1990s. Previous video detailed how in 1990 Lesbian Line won an award from Cooperation North, but as giving an award to a lesbian organisation was seen as controversial at this time, no women from Lesbian Line were actually invited to attend the celebratory photo shoot. Unfortunately, this type of discrimination was quite common, and women's news were on the receiving end of a lot of prejudice. In 1991, a Halloween fundraiser party for the magazine that was due to take place in a private function room at Kelly's Cellar Bar in Belfast was cancelled after the pub discovered that there would probably be lesbians in attendance. This is written about in detail in a 1991 issue where the author states, "I understand the reason for cancelling the event to be as it was a women's party. It appeared that Kelly's interpreted this to mean a lesbian party and did not wish for the pub to acquire a gay image." And you can see from the cartoon here how this was dealt with in the magazine. In 1992, there was a reception at Belfast City Hall for International Women's Day. Women from a variety of organisations were initially invited, only to be uninvited at the last minute. This included women from the Burke Clinic, which was the sexual health clinic for young people, the Falls Women's Centre, Sinn Féin, Lesbian Line and Women's News. It is interesting to note how women's news were often aligned with nationalist groups, despite the fact that the magazine did not take any political positions. But this position was often fostered onto them and perceived in them by others. So this little cartoon here shows Seamus Lynch getting a little bit of heat. Seamus Lynch was the chair of the Community Services Committee, and apparently he had a very unattractive tie. As you can see from the use of cartoons, serious instances of discrimination were often satirized, and humour was used as a way to cope with these very serious instances of exclusion. It's important to remember, however, that this was the time of Section 20 in England, which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality. As such, lesbians were often seen as a liability in women's movements and in leftist organisations as well. Lesbians were central to a lot of work, but had to keep it quiet. And this was similar to the position of a lot of lesbians in women's movements globally. The idea of the Lavender Menace, as lesbians were often referred to, did not escape Northern Irish politics and society either. However, a rising number of younger women in women's news brought a new confidence. The first Pride was called Lesbian and Gay Pride, and this took place in 1991. Around 100 people attended this parade, but in the next years that followed, only 30 to 40 people attended as they were scared. It was a very daunting experience. And Katrine Covert writes that people were met with shock, surprise, and horror in the city centre. The wording of the first Pride was not meant to be intentionally exclusivist, but as Katrine notes, there was barely an understanding of bisexuality, let alone trans issues. From Catherine Covert described it as a lot of work, but the images in women's news did not showcase this aspect. Rather, they celebrated the joviality of the occasion, and you can really see the sense of fun through the use of pictures in this article. From 1995 onwards, there was a growing confidence and Pride became bigger. In 1995 and 1996, Women's News sat on the Pride Committee. However, in the following years, they decided to have a separate lesbian Pride as there was a feeling of resentment if they had more than one or two events. And why was this? Well, as Katrine details, women were expected to take a second place, not only in wider society, but also in the LGBT scene. By the late 1990s, however, queer was being more commonly used. And the last video talked about the creation of Queerspace in 1997, and there was a general feeling of new optimism. As we've seen, Pride has continued to grow and it is now in its 30th year. And this is a picture of Belfast Pride in 2019 when we were physically allowed on the street. In summary, Women's News played a crucial role in giving women of all sexualities and backgrounds a voice in an often oppressive society during some of the most turbulent years of Northern Irish history. It was successful in achieving the aims of its Womanifesto to provide a space for views and opinions and to allow groups to let other women know what is happening. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and we look forward to talking about it at the Q&A. Thank you.